case anybody hasn't been here before, we're doing a double book here. It's got both books in it, The Way of the Pilgrim and The Pilgrim Continues the Way. And we are on The Pilgrim Continues the Way. In my book, it's page 146. And they've been discussing prayer. They've met a very holy monk who had written a paper on prayer from the Gospels, and a lot of elucidation that we've been reading over the last couple of weeks. Now he's finished reading it, and our pilgrim, which is where we're going to start. We already read this paragraph last week, but it makes sense to start from this paragraph, so we'll read it again. Sharing their ideas and their questions and their appreciation about this wonderful treatise on prayer. And basically, they have all praise. They said that prayer is the way, and when they say prayer, they mean the whole gamut of prayer, repeating the Jesus prayer, just praying, being in conversation with the divine. And of course, the highest form of prayer, the most mature form. And when I say that, we all want to get competitive and be like, oh, the highest, that's the only good one. Then that's what we got to get to. Not the truth. What we're saying is that there's a progression that's natural to someone who earnestly and sincerely prays. And in the final one, it just involves a deep, intimate communion that ultimately ends in oneness. Now, because Christian theology doesn't allow for that oneness, St. John of the Cross says that basically you become so purified that you're as clear as a pane of glass. And so when you're in front of God, nobody can see you. They can only see God because you've become so purified that you're like a piece of glass. So that's how he kept himself from being burned at the stake, I assumed, by putting that little disclaimer in there. And but that it's through prayer that this can be attained. And there's something tonight that he says that we're going to read in a minute. I cheated earlier. I was reading it. It's a really wonderful statement, and I'm very excited to kind of share it. But we'll start with the pilgrim. Our pilgrim is ecstatic about this teaching, this reading that they've been doing together. The pilgrim says, "With all my heart, I thank you, Holy Father. With that reading of yours, you have given pleasure to my sinful soul." Let's see, souls aren't sinful. So let's kind of catch that first right there. That which is sinful is the material, and it's not even sinful in that sense without meeting mind. Mind is the one that gives value to things. Things in and of themselves are always neutral. It's not until they meet the divine image within you that they become good or bad. And if you're not comparing from the divine image, then you're comparing from ego. And that's just your likes and your dislikes. So that reading of yours, you have given pleasure to my sinful soul. For the love of God, be so kind as to allow me to copy out for myself what you have read. I can do it in an hour or two. Everything you read was so beautiful and comforting and is so understandable and clear to my stupid mind, like the Philokalia, in which the Holy Fathers treat the same subject. Here, for instance, John Karpathisky, in the fourth part of the Philokalia, also says that if you have not the strength for self-control and ascetic achievements, then know that God is willing to save you by prayer. But how beautifully and understandably all that is drawn out in your notebook. I thank God, first of all, and then you, that I have been allowed to hear it. So we see a wonderful attitude on the part of the pilgrim. Of course, we've seen this attitude in him, how eager and earnest and sincere he's been all the way through both books in his love of truth, his love of scripture. And anytime he gets an opportunity to learn, if he runs into somebody that he thinks might know more than him, he immediately is querying, can you teach me something? What can you tell me? How can you lead me? And he keeps getting these beautiful, sorry to use your last name, but he gets these beautiful nuggets of truth all the time. And I'm really thrilled with this little piece that he says right here. He says, uh, the fourth part of the Philokalia also says that if you don't have the strength for self-control, and if you don't have strength for ascetic achievements, these high discipline practices, then know that God is willing to save you by prayer. This is the path of bhakti. It's that relationship. Since we're reading Christian literature, we'll talk in terms of salvation and whatnot. But you've come to your realization. You have your salvation through relationship, through your trust and acceptance of supreme grace that begins to occur to us through our practice of knowing an unconditioned love, through contemplating the love of God for us. And so in that love relationship, the particulars are not as important. Now, this is always dangerous when we talk about those things and we say that living that life or having that absolute purity or that absolute pristine whatever is not necessary. The mind, the ego self, immediately jumps in and wants license. It's like, oh, well, look at that. I don't have to do that part. and I can know God and it'll be fine. Oh, good. So you kind of give up and take license in love. But that's only that's if that's the first thought in your mind, then know that your ego still needs quite a bit of renunciation, because that's the ego wanting to take license and make more room for itself. And that's not what we're interested in. Because if you respond in love to such a gift of love, that is what brings about your knowledge of God. That's what brings about your enlightenment. It's responding in love, not in license. Not thinking, oh, look, God's not looking, I can do this now. And because he loves me, he won't hurt me. And which may be true. But nonetheless, if you live that way, you lose your edge, actually. And slowly, that green scum will cover over the clear water of the pond of your mind. And you'll find yourself suffering more suddenly, and that life is not quite as free as it had been, because that's the nature of living with the ego in charge. The world gets small, your mind gets small, you start getting irritated by small things, people offend you easily, people bother you easily, all those kinds of things start happening. And that's when we're living from ego space. But this is a truth nonetheless, that religion is not all about your discipline and your self-control and your yamas and niyamas, doing only the right things and pushing away the not right things. All of that's there, but love is the biggest thing in religion, period. Love is the biggest thing in period. Love is the biggest thing. Any category. Love is the point of the universe. That might be bold. I'll send you upstairs to complain if you don't agree, but I'm pretty sure that this is true, that that love is the biggest thing in the universe, and that in the scriptures, everything should be always looked through the lens of love to give a proper understanding of it, so that the ego doesn't jump in there with that mischief of finding loopholes. It's the ego's like a rich man doing his taxes. How can I get the most and pay the least? And that's not a spiritual value. Actually, it's not even spiritual consciousness. If spiritual, there would be no thought about that, because it's simply not in the mind. So he says that. So he lays this out, and he's saying not only did he hear this in this paper as a study of the four Gospels, he said he also knows about it from the fourth part of the Philokalia under the writings of that monk Karpathiski, and so he's found it. He's found it twice in his holy scriptures. So he's very excited about it, and he says, "I thank God first of all, and then you, that I have been allowed to hear it." Right, and this is really something. that we are allowed to hear it, that we have any interest in hearing it, that we're actually investing time in hearing it, is a beautiful testament to the divine taking care of us. Giving us truths that can help us with depression, giving us truths that can help us with selfishness, give us truths that can help us find meaning and purpose and profundity and depth in being, that we're not stuck on just the material plane, which becomes so empty and so I don't know why I stopped myself from saying that, but I did. So boring. It's like if the world really was just material, how many combinations of the five, meaning the senses, can you get lost in? I mean, after a while, it's just like, so what? You've done everything. And you would have to reach such extremes for entertainment if you were allowed to live for 1,000 years or 1,500 years. You would have tried everything many times, and there's nothing there. There's no there. And so he understands that. And so he sees these teachings as an oasis from that sentence, from the sentence, being condemned to material. He's saved from that. So the professor, who is also, he's a third party listening to this same reading with our pilgrim, he says his part. I also listened with great attention and pleasure to your reading, Reverend Father. All arguments, when they rest upon strict logic, are a delight to me. So it's proper that he's a professor. See? So he's heard this whole thing academically. Our pilgrim's heard it with his heart and is very excited from that perspective. Our professor here has heard it with his mind and has taken it in as philosophy and as facts. And so he's stored it up there. And he says, when they rest upon strict logic, they're a delight to me because they love that. That's thinking for the intellectual is very pleasant. That's a form of enjoyment. But at the same time, it seems to me that they make the possibility of continual prayer in a high degree dependent on circumstances which are favorable to it and upon entirely quiet solitude. For I agree that frequent and ceaseless prayer is a powerful and unique means of obtaining the help of divine grace in all acts of devotion for the sanctifying of the soul, and that it is within the power of man. But this method can be used only when man avails himself of the possibility of solitude and quiet. In getting away from business and worries and distractions, he can pray frequently or even continually. He then has to contend only with sloth or with tedium of his own thoughts. But if he is bound by duties and by constant business, if he necessarily finds himself in a noisy company of people and has an earnest desire to pray often, he cannot carry out this desire because of the inevitable distractions. Consequently, the one method of frequent prayer, since it is dependent upon favorable circumstances, cannot be used by everybody, nor belong to everybody. So it's interesting because this is the way these things appear when we come at it from an academic perspective. We're like, I don't have time for it. I've got to raise my kids. I've got to go take my job. I've got to wash the car. I've got to grocery shop. I've got to cook. My Lord, when am I going to be able to do all of this stuff? It's a worldly man's approach. It's like, it can't be done. And the ego's very happy with that. The ego's like, right on. Yeah, I'm justified. I don't have to do that. So what's our shkimnik, our realized soul, our very accomplished father say? He says, it is no use drawing a conclusion of that kind. It's like, that's pointless. We didn't just lay out all of that so that you can just dismiss it because you're a busy man. He's like, not to mention the fact that the heart, which has been taught interior prayer, can always pray upon the name of God unhindered during any occupation, whether of the body or of the mind, and in any noise. Those who know this know it from experience, and those who do not know it must be taught by gradual training. One can confidently say that no outward distraction can interrupt prayer in one who wishes to pray. For the secret thought of man does not depend upon any link with external environment and is entirely free in itself. Look at this. See, here, right here in the Christian scriptures, you're finding this freedom of the soul. You know, that this unchanging absolute, which we're going to call the image of God in Christian speak, the image of God that was placed within us at our creation, exists within us, that divine absolute, and it cannot be touched by anything in the material world, cannot be disturbed, cannot be polluted, cannot be, well, just touched. It can't be reached by anything in the world. And so he's saying here, there is no excuse, no reason that a person who desires to pray can't pray, regardless of how busy, how responsibly overburdened they are, that this internal prayer can always go on. And the person who practices it knows it because he experiences that you can be sitting there, you know, doing your job, and your joblum can be running in the back of your mind while you're working on your spreadsheet or while you're writing your proposal, you know. And every now and then when you sit back and stop writing, it comes to the forefront. You give it a little bit more energy and a little bit more focus for a second or two, and then you just lean forward and go back into your work again. So those who practice this continual prayer know that it's possible to do it at all times. And Ramakrishna also, remember that story that he tells about the woman who works in the mill, and she's got her baby in one hand and she's breastfeeding it. And there's a customer at the counter and she's talking about the amount of money that they owe and giving change. And then the mill wheel is turning behind her, and she, with her other hand, is taking out the flour and putting in more corn for more grinding, and that she's doing all of these things at the same time without any trouble at all. And he says that is how you do this. And then he goes on to say, you know, I've already done 15/16 of what needs to be done. You only have to do a 16th. You know, so you do your 16th. I've got the rest covered. But it's this notion, you know, stick to the heart. Don't go to the mind, where you'll find academic excuses for why it's impossible to do what you need to do and how you can't possibly do that. You can't control yourself. You can't make this happen, blah, 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 blah. I've tried so many times. I can't make it. No. In this moment, you're free. In this moment, if you take away your past and your future, you are full potential, 100% potential for anything. And you can direct that marble at the top of the sphere to roll off that sphere in any direction because you're free, right? So insist on your freedom and turn your heart to the beloved. Give your heart to the love, you know. Don't look for reasons it can't be done. Jump in and do the best you can. And Thakur will take care of the rest. The divine will take care of the rest. So, a beautiful promise. It can, at all times, be perceived and directed toward prayer. Even the very tongue can secretly, without outward sound, express prayer in the presence of many people and during external occupations. Besides, our business is surely not so important and our conversations so interesting that it is impossible during them to find a way at times of frequently calling upon the name of Jesus, even if the mind has not yet been trained in continuous prayer. So he's saying, one, it's possible. You know, it can be done, and it can be done silently, even if you're in a big crowd, even if there's lots of noise going on. There's no reason that it can't be done. And then he makes the more important point. Not only can it be done, but even if you have trouble doing it, your conversation is not so interesting that you can't shut up and do some more prayer. Your engagements are not so demanding that you can't pause briefly and establish yourself in prayer and then go back to it. So from two fronts, he's saying this is egoism. Your complaint doesn't stand up. Although, of course, solitude and escape from distracting things does constitute the chief condition for attentive and continuous prayer, still, we ought to feel ourselves to blame for the rarity of our prayer, because the amount and frequency is under the control of everybody, both the healthy and the sick. So he's saying, take back your responsibility. If you don't have time for prayer, it's not because you're so busy and there's so many things demanded of you that you don't have time to pray. It's because you've been a fool in putting your life together and have filled it with so many things that you don't have time to think of the divine anymore. He says, so even if there was the possibility that you could get so busy and be so engaged, he said, that's not an excuse. That's an indictment on yourself. You've made the wrong choices. You filled your life up with the wrong things. So reconsider your priorities. There's always time to do what you love. Always. Everybody will find time to do what they love. And so if you love to pray, if spiritual life is that important to you, there's time for it, and you'll make that time for it. It does lie within the scope of his will. Instances which prove this are to be found in those who, although burdened by obligations, distracting duties, cares, worries, and work, have not only always called upon the divine name of Jesus Christ, but even in this way learned and attained the ceaseless inward prayer of the heart. He's saying there's plenty of examples of busy people. Look at kings. Look at all the kings in the Old Testament. King David, sometimes referred to as God's one of God's best friends. You don't think a king is busy? There's stories of these kings riding out on the battlefield, and they're still doing their prayers. Still thinking that one beautiful story. I don't know all the details because that's the nature of my mind, but that king that was in his shrine room and was dedicated to his practice of prayer, and his kingdom is attacked, and his wife is coming and trying to get him out of the shrine room because he's got to call together the army. He's got to get out and defend the kingdom, and he won't move from there. He won't come out from there. And so finally he comes out, and he puts on his armor, and they get on the horse, and they ride out onto the field, and the enemy is already all dead. The bodies are all scattered all over the field, except for the king. The king was the king of the enemy king was spared, and the enemy king comes up to him and treats him with devotion, and says, "Who was that blue warrior that came out and wiped out my entire army?" And he did. Of course, the king doesn't know anything of it. He's like, I have no idea. But of course, he comes to know that blue warrior was Krishna, whom he had been worshiping in the shrine. And that when he gave it to Krishna, Krishna took the action, took the responsibility. And, so we can go into supernatural, miraculous ways that this is possible as well. So you can choose which one you want. But we've got 3 refutations to the impossibility. Did you raise your hand, Shrikant, or is that just a thing on your screen?
Yeah. No, I
Yes.
did. So did you give an example of the same example of the kings? Because I know a lot of kings in olden India, they were really masters of Vedanta, and all that, and all the philosophies about God. So are there similar examples in Christianity too, like King David? Is that
Mm-hmm.
the example you gave?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, okay. Let me more for me to explore. Thank you.
Yes, certainly. Yeah, King David wrote most of the Psalms in the book of Psalms in the Old Testament. And so many of them are very, very beautiful. A handful of them are horribly disturbing. And the rest, and then there's a large number of them that pray quite shocking prayers about the defeat of your enemy. So read them with some discernment. I spent a year in a Christian monastery about 5 years ago up in West Park, New York, and every day, 5 times during the day, we would assemble in the church, and we would chant the Psalms. And I went to the abbot actually and complained. I was like, I don't want to chant that stuff. I don't want my enemies buried so far in Sheol that they can never find salvation again and will suffer, forever. I was like, this is very disturbing for me to even read that, let alone chant it every day. I said, why is it even in there? Why, why is it even like that? And he said something very interesting that actually made it all right with me. He said, you see, the Psalms are an expression of life, raw life, life as it is. And he says it's an expression of life as it is from people who are living life as it is. And they're crying out to God, and that's what we should see. And they're wrestling with their own inner self, their lower natures, and that's what we should see. They're not teaching us anything. They're expressing their experience and their wrestling and their fight for knowing God. So he says, don't expect pure scriptures from the Psalms. The Psalms are there to tell the story of finding God, the struggles, the challenges, the victories and the defeats. And so don't read them with a moral judgment like that. He said, just hear the wrestling, hear the efforts, hear the emotions, and understand that life is just this way. It's not always obviously spiritual. It's not obviously great all the time. So it's a very, very interesting approach to it. But yeah, no, King David, is a very big star of the Old Testament because it's
Okay.
interesting. He and God were very close to each other. He was very dedicated to the divine, but he was mostly an upright man. But he had some shocking downfalls. You know, he murders somebody. He commits adultery. He does a few things, and yet the Lord sticks with him. So it's quite there's some quite some stories in there.
Thank you.
Sure. Thus, the patriarch Photius, who was called to the patriarchal dignity from among the ranks of the senators, while governing the vast diocese of Constantinople, persevered continually in the invocation of the name of God, and thus attained even the self acting prayer of the heart. Thus, Callistus, on the holy Mount Athos, learned ceaseless prayer while carrying on his business in life as a cook. Ah, that would be Brother Lawrence, probably. So the simple hearted Lazarus, burdened with continual work for the brotherhood, uninterruptedly in the midst of all of his noisy occupations, repeated the Jesus prayer and was at peace. And many others similarly have practiced the continuous invocation of the name of God. So, really, the message for us is like, guys, we can do this. This is totally possible for us to do. Get that name of the beloved circling in the mind continually, and it will comb out all of the tangles of your thinking and help you find your bliss, find your joy in living. It will teach you how to laugh heartily in this world without getting caught by it. And so this is the power of this prayer. He goes on to make his point. If it were an impossible thing to pray amidst distracting business or in the society of other people, then of course it would not have been bidden us. We wouldn't have been asked to do it if it was impossible. St. John Chrysostom, in his teaching about prayer, speaks as follows: no one should give the answer that it is impossible for a man occupied with worldly cares and who is unable to go to church to pray always. Everywhere, wherever you may find yourself, you can set up an altar to God in your mind by means of prayer. And so it is fitting to pray at your trade, on a journey, standing at the counter, sitting at your handicraft. Everywhere and in every place, it is possible to pray. And indeed, if a man diligently turns his attention upon himself, right? That's what the sages have all told us. That's that looking inward, turning our attention, taking it off of the world of the changing and turning it inwardly to the world of the unchanging, to the inner life of yourself. Diligently turns his attention upon himself, and then everywhere he will find convenient circumstances for prayer, if only he is convinced of the fact that prayer should constitute his chief occupation, and come before every other duty, right? So it's possible to the person who values it above everything else, right? And this is the thing. This is core and central to our life, that we should make every effort. It should be our highest priority. Mm-hmm. See, this is great stuff. This is why mother, this is why mother has me doing these classes because she calls me out on the spot. She has me saying these things, and I'm like, oh my god, I've got to get in here and tighten some screws again. This is like the third or fourth time this week I've been challenged to tighten my screws. So this is the whole point of this. It's brilliant to be challenged like this. Yes, Shrikant.
Swami, this is a question I've been wanting to ask a long time. So when you
Yes.
call mother, are you calling the nature as mother, or the Kali Ma or Sharadama? Whom are you referring to as mother?
Everyone who answers.
Hmm. Hmm.
Everyone who answers. I don't have distinctions in my mind. I wasn't raised with Kali and Durga, Lakshmi, and all of that. So those are very academic distinctions for me personally. I'm not saying that they are for everybody or in fact, but I mean for myself. And so to me, the Divine Mother, I'm when I went to for the 25 years I've been in the monastery, every time I've had to go to a Kali puja or a Durga puja, you know, I never sat there and worshipped Ma Kali because I don't know Ma Kali. I never sat there and worshipped Ma Durga because I don't know Ma Durga. I always worshipped Holy Mother, Sri Sharda Devi, because Ramakrishna said she was the embodiment of all gods and goddesses. And he also, well, she's yeah, anyway. So I would sit. And so for me, God as mother is more of a divine approach to a divine quality as opposed to a definition of a divine personhood.
And specifically, you're calling the Prakriti, right? Which is what the Bhagavad Gita or that is called Ma in
Yes.
your sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Although I don't even really make that distinction either, because I think all of it, all the possible manifestations of the divine are gathered together in the divine absolute, the unchanging absolute. And so the full potential for all manifestations of the divine are in that. And so we live in Prakriti. We live in the changing world, and we contain Prakriti within our own self. We contain them both. Active mind is Prakriti. Pure mind or silent mind is Brahman. And so we have the ability to experience, well, not experience, because once mind stops, there's no experiencing. But yeah, you see, they come together. So yeah, there's a oneness there for us, and God becomes whatever reaches us the deepest.
Right.
You know, and
Right.
so yeah. That's why Thakur told that woman who, she was like, I feel so guilty because I love my grandchild so much that anytime I sit down, I can't think of God. I can only think of my grandchild. And what's Ramakrishna tell her, most of us would think that he'd slap her hand and tell her to get it together and, renounce your grandchild.
See
He
God in the grandchild. Yeah. He says, see
yeah,
God in the grandchild.
that's right. That's right. Because God can be reached through whatever we love the most, he will manifest to us that way. And so he told her, put the picture of your grandchild on your shrine and worship God through that.
Mm.
So it's whatever you love the most, that God will approach you that way. you know yes.
Just on the same topic, Swami, you call mother so many times, and this is a
Uh-huh.
frank, uh, uh, you know, I want to tell this long back. you call mother so many times, you really feel like a small child, and and it feels like, for us, you feel like I'm your mother, for example. I used to, because you say it with so honesty and so, honestly you say that. I think I feel like that, I'm your mother, for example. So,
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, definitely. Mother's delightful when you're helpless. It's like because I came into spiritual life uh, through Holy Mother, through Shardamat in Dakshineshwar,
okay.
and it was only because of God as Mother that I was able to believe in enough grace to try again. Because I started my life as a fundamentalist Christian, and that was disastrous for me. It was just disastrous, and had a very violent parting of the ways. And because I had been a fundamentalist, I kind of thought that was my only option in the world. I thought that once I'd walked away from that, there was nothing else. And so I just walked into the world for a decade, and just tried to find some fulfillment there, and had looked in enough places that I got pretty dirty in those 10 years. And so when I went to see Pravrajika Moksha Prana in Dakshineshwar, I didn't really, I went because I was curious, because my friend that I was traveling with, Philip, who is he's a professor of mathematics, and he told me that she was enlightened, and I laughed out loud, actually. I thought, how how can you believe that? I said, and so he told me he was going to go see her, and so I was like, well, why? And he says, well, I've heard she's enlightened, and I said, well, what does that mean? He said, well, she's had the God experience, and I said, well, what does that mean? And he said, well, she's seen God. And I looked down and I was like, in this day and age, people are still saying that? Are you kidding me? And he's like, no. And so I was like, well, would you mind if I came along? I wouldn't mind seeing her. I was in India as a tourist, and so I went along just to get a glimpse of someone who claimed to have the God experience, right?
Oh,
And
wow.
so when I got to Shardamat, and the amount of grace that I felt, the amount of kindness that I felt, the sweetness in the way that these nuns would converse with me and answer my questions. And I was so touched by that I was actually inspired to think, wow, maybe, maybe there is a way to do this. Maybe there is. And it was only because of Mother, only because God became Mother as opposed to Father. Because I couldn't relate to a father in terms of grace. I had to relate to a father in terms of performance. you know, I was I wasn't performing. So yes, everywhere. So that's why my heart is Mother's, because she brought me here. And for my first couple of years in the monastery, I did only Mother. I didn't like Thakur. I was kind of afraid of Thakur. I was kind of like, I don't know, that guy's he's pretty intense. And Vivekananda, I didn't have two nickels for Vivekananda. I thought, oh, that guy's such a blustery blowhard. I don't want to. I just wasn't into him at all. His manliness and all of that. I was just like, well, I don't know what that's all about. That's weird for me. And so I did. It took me about 8 or 9 years to warm up to Vivekananda. Uh, Thakur, it was like the third or fourth year that I was in the monastery. And this probably sounds oovy groovy, but it just, no, it's my own interior nonsense. But I was in the shrine one day, and I distinctly had the feeling, or the, call it an experience, but don't put anything supernatural in there. Mother handed me over to Thakur. She ducked out, and Thakur started showing up, not showing up, but began visualizing naturally Thakur in my mind more than Mother, and that lasted for a few years. And then when I started lecturing, that's when I fell in love with Vivekananda, because my God, boy, does he say some beautiful things, and does he know how to say them? And the way he puts all of these things together for me was just wow. So finally, I warmed up to Vivekananda as well. And so now I've got my family. I've got my mama, my papa, and my big brother.
Nice, nice, nice.
Yeah. Yeah, and each one of them has a different set of a different way of reaching us. For mother, it's that sweet love, that convincing grace. With Thakur, it's just that outrageous integrity and relentless optimism, and just profound conviction of the presence of the divine, and his sweetness, his renunciation. And then with Vivekananda, beautiful renunciation, and what a dedication to the way he just walked right in, with his whole life and offered it to the divine. A
Right.
very talented man who could have been anything, could have done anything, and he renounces. And then, best of all, he came here. you know, Best of all, because I would never have heard any of these things. I would never have had this opportunity. So I understand our young pilgrim's delight at the beginning when he was like, thank you so much that I can even hear these things, because these were things would have been forbidden me without Ramakrishna. I would have, you know, just been alone without it. So anyway, is that, were we answering a question?
Yes, yes, you did, and yes, I'm really happy you shared your a lot of your experience too. I'm very happy. Yeah, and this is why I really felt that way. For 1 day, 2 days, I really felt that like you're you're my kid for some. That's why I was trying to get you more audience and everything, and then it just faded away for some time. So
Yeah, it is. All right. So everywhere and in every place, it is possible to pray. And indeed, if a man diligently turns his attention upon himself, if you go inward, then everywhere he will find convenient circumstances for prayer. If only he is convinced of the fact that prayer should constitute his chief occupation, it should be your number one business and come before every other duty, your number one business and your number one priority, right? If you've got that and you're going inward, those are the pieces you need. And in that case, he would, of course, order his affairs with greater decision, which means that he would organize his life around his most important pursuant. Pursuant? Does that work? Can I say that? In necessary conversation with other people, he would maintain brevity, a tendency to silence, and a disinclination for useless words. He would not be unduly anxious about worrisome things. So we've got a nice little list there, a nice little list for us to live up to, right? So the signs of someone who wants to approach the divine, that we would order our affairs with greater decision. We wouldn't just take on anything. We would say, no, I've got to maintain my practice and my prayer, and not just my practice, but the condition of my own mind. We have to protect that inner silence. We have to protect that inner shrine. We don't let the kids come running through the middle of the shrine. In Washington D.C., we had those summer camps with all those kids, and the kids would start chasing each other around the temple, and we let them do it mostly because we didn't have the energy to stop them. But but when they would go into the shrine, if they were ever caught messing around in the shrine, that's the place that we would send them outside. Say, no, you can't. What are you doing running around in here? This is not where we do that. And so you have to have that same attitude about your shrine, the shrine of the heart, right? So you have to make sure that nobody tramples over that time or violates that sanctity. So we have to do that. So yes. So what is it? So we would think about our affairs with greater decision, and in necessary conversation with other people, we would maintain brevity. So we wouldn't just go on talking sports for the whole afternoon and miss our afternoon prayer time. We say what needs to be said. We're kind, we're considerate, we're cordial, but we make it brief. We deal with it. We don't get lost in the entertainment of engagement. A tendency toward silence. If there's nothing to say, nothing is said. Just be quiet. I had to learn that. I've shared that story, in the monastery. Anytime it would get silent at the table, I would do my duty and interject a new topic of discussion. And Greg one day took me aside in the kitchen and said, you don't always have to talk at the table. And which was good that he told me, because I enjoyed many, many years of silent dinners with Swami Prabhupada, where we didn't say anything to each other, just sat there in silence. And when you're with a great sadhu like that, there's always atmosphere. There's always a wonderful atmosphere that when you're silent in someone's presence like that, you get a bunch of gifts. You naturally think of God in the presence of a holy person, which is marvelous. Marvelous. That's why you want to be holy, so that the people around you can find their way. So a tendency to silence and a disinclination for useless words, for just chit-chatting about nothing. He would not be unduly anxious about worrisome things, because God's in charge, God's in control. You know yourself as soul. Nothing but there's nothing to endanger the soul, nothing to stress the soul out. It's only bodies and minds that get stressed out. And so when we come to remember this too shall pass, then we can let it go and become less caught up in it. And in all these ways, he would find more time for quiet prayer. In such an order of life, all his actions, by the power of the invocation of the name of God, would be signalized by success. And finally, he would train himself to the uninterrupted prayerful invocation of the name of Jesus Christ. He would come to know from experience that frequency of prayer, this sole means of salvation, is a possibility for the will of man, that it is possible to pray at all times, in all circumstances, and in every place, and easily to rise from frequent vocal prayer to prayer of the mind, and from that to prayer of the heart, which opens the kingdom of God within us. So you see, he just listed that progression that we talked about. In the beginning, prayer is just like you and me sitting here chit-chatting, Oh, what a day, God. Man, I couldn't believe you put me through that today. Don't do that again. Oh, and by the way, Martha up in accounting, she's sick. Can you help her out? That's how prayer happens in the beginning. And then after you've kind of shared all those things for a few years, and you're kind of running out of things to say out loud, you just kind of sit there with Thakur and you say half sentences, and that's all that's necessary. It's more just for you to keep a placeholder in your prayer. Just ideas come forward and you lay them out, and you don't have to pray for specifics, because Mother knows you and you know Mother. So you don't have to say all of that. And then it goes to the prayer of the heart, that final stage. So it comes from outside to the mind and then to the heart. And in the heart, it's worship. In the heart, you're in the presence of God. Yeah, in the heart, the beloved is there. And there's nothing necessary to say, because the body isn't between you anymore. The barriers are not between you anymore. And God has full access to your heart, to your mind, to your experience, to what you are. And you just enjoy the spiritual suntan. You just sit there in such a profound sense of peace and such a wonderful existence in that moment, in that presence. And you're changed. All those things that you spent all your years trying to change. And with all of your effort, you couldn't, and you can't. You stayed the same. But when you reach the heart, those things of their own accord begin to change, find their way. So this is the nature of prayer. And that final state, it leads us to the kingdom of God within. It leads us, in the way I like to think about it, it leads us right back into the Garden of Eden. That we conquer the angel with the flaming sword, which is desire, and then we get to go back into paradise, and we can eat then of the second tree that grows in the garden, which is the tree of immortality. So all of that lies within you in this moment. It's there within you. It's like if we could believe it, we'd go insane in our effort to try and get there. To know that paradise is imminent and so close, and yet so far. But this prayer, this inner communion, this is the thing. How the professor. I agree that during mechanical occupations, it is possible and even easy to pray frequently, even continuously. For mechanical bodily work does not require profound exercise of the mind or great consideration. And therefore, while it is going on, my mind can be immersed in continuous prayer and my lips follow in the same way. But if I have to be occupied with something exclusively intellectual, as for instance, attentive reading, or thinking out some deep matter or literary composition, how can I pray with my mind and my lips in such a case? And since prayer is above all things and action of the mind, how at one and the same time can I give one and the same mind different sorts of things to do? Now, before we hear what our revered father is going to say, well, what are your thoughts on that? Anybody have an idea? Do you agree with what he's saying? Is that a good point, that intellectual things require the whole mind? You can't talk to God, or you can't continue this prayer in that state?
In the beginning, yes,
Because the
but as you
thing,
practice, in the
yeah,
beginning,
well,
yes, but as you practice, it becomes a natural, and you can do that.
yeah, but it's even easier than that. You don't really need to do it in a way that needs to be worked at. If you're reading something, read it to God.
Right.
Read it to the presence of the mother within you. You know, if you have to think about something deeply, then invite mother and sit there and share it with her as you're thinking about it deeply. This is a companionship, you and the beloved. And if the beloved's always there, all the thinking you can do in the presence of the beloved. And that's the wonder of it. That's the beauty of it, is this wonderful companionship that we have available to us that's palpable. It starts as an imaginary friend, quite frankly. It does. It starts as an imaginary friend, and you play with that imagination. And then perhaps at some time, something will happen that's bigger than imagination within you. You'll get, like you'll be trying to picture Thakur in your mind, during your meditation. And that's always a very difficult thing to do. But at some point, perhaps you'll get a vision of Thakur in your mind that is so clear for just a brief flash of a moment, that is so hyper beyond any resolution of a thought that you've ever had. And you suddenly get suspicious. Wow, what was that? Or you sit in silence after asking a question or sharing a struggle, and an answer arises in your mind. You don't know where it came from, but the whole thing comes, in your mind. I remember I had an experience kind of like that, and I speak about it because I don't think it's that big of a deal. I think this is readily available to all of us. There was one time where I was sitting and I was supposed to give a class to a group online in Europe, and I had already written out a whole class that I was going to give. But while I was sitting there in prayer, literally, Mother dropped in and in an entire class in a second. It wasn't like I had to build it up and think it out. Suddenly, there was this entire outline. There was this entire theme for a talk right there. And I was like, where did that where did that come from?
That's cool.
Yeah, it was. It's amazing. And that's happened significantly more than one time, actually, in the last 10 years, 12 years. But again, I'm always nervous talking about these things because people want to make something of them, like, oh, ooh, this, that, and the other. There is no this, that, and the other. I'm a dude from here all the way to my toes. There's nothing more. Just a struggler trying to get on the path and trying to find my heart's beloved. That's it. And so God's kindness is to blame, right? Don't blame the Swami. You always blame God's kindness. And it's available. And it's natural, actually. It's the way things are, the way they could be all the time. If we could just train this toddler of a mind to behave itself, to be quiet and listen for a second. you know?
And just like you mentioned, it's like the toddler's, problem. When he's learning cycle without those, training wheels, he doesn't know. If he want to ride, he cannot balance. If he want to balance, he cannot ride. But slowly, as he practice, he can do both. He can balance both at the same time, right?
Yeah,
So it's similar to that.
yeah, and actually, it becomes ultimately. I think it's not a matter of doing multiple things at once. It's that everything you do is done to God, and so that's part and parcel of what you do. So you're not juggling. You've reached a point where your companionship with God is so alive inside, and so dynamic inside, that you work with God. God, you sit in the taxi with God, you read a book with God, you take a shower with God, you shave with God. You'll be like, Ma, what is this thing, Ma? That didn't used to be there. Why did you put this thing in the middle of my face? You know? Your mother's like, because you needed humility. Oh, okay, no problem. But anyway, these things like that, God is everywhere present and always perfect, and you get to know that on a personal level. You get to walk with the divine. You begin to recognize the movement of God within yourself. You begin to wonder where your thoughts are coming from, and you begin to wonder how your actions happen. You begin to wonder about this thing that I always share about. you know that you move your finger and you don't know how that's happening, and you become aware that most of the stuff that you do, you don't know how it happens, and yet the ego is always right there ready to take responsibility for it. I did that. And you're like, how can you do something you don't even know how to do? What do you mean? It's like, what's going on with that? So this is the thing. Now let's see what our father says here. Oh, it's 8:04. You're gonna have to wait till next week. We
So
have a
one
cliffhanger
last
this
thing.
week. Yes.
Sarah, I posted that about John C. Lilly, who he was, and this quote in the chat. Maybe you want to pick it up.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. He's
Yeah,
interesting.
he is. He is.
Very
Yeah.
cool. No,
He,
Yeah,
he
thanks.
he's
used
I'll
to
get
meet
started.
Ramdas, and those
also
folks. Actually, yeah.
he was also a psychoanalyst. I thought that was very interesting.
Yep.
Really, and a neuro